It was March the 6th, 1944, and the airmen of the United States 8th Air Force were conducting their 250th mission of the Second World War. The mission was important not just because of the milestone being the 8th's 250th mission, but also because of the enormous size of the raid, a stunning 1,758 airplanes involved, 814 bomber aircraft, and 944 fighter aircraft. To that date, the largest air armada ever assembled for a single mission in world history. And it wasn't just the mission's great size or the milestone of the 250th mission that made the mission interesting. The 8th Air Force was attacking the very heart of the German Reich. They were bombing the German capital city of Berlin in broad daylight. Berlin was arguably the most heavily defended target that the 8th Air Force would face during the Second World War. And the 250th bomber mission changed the face of that war, but at great cost. The mission that became known as Black Monday deserves to be remembered. It was not the first Allied bombing raid on Berlin. RAF Bomber Command had been carrying out raids, some very large, on the German capital since 1940. It was not the first U.S. 8th Air Force raid on Berlin. 3 days earlier, some 300 bombers had flown a mission there. But the raid on Berlin, March 6, 1944, was the first U.S. daylight bombing raid in force over the German capital. A raid of unprecedented scale over one of Hitler's most well-defended targets, some 500 miles from the 8th Air Force's bases in East Anglia. It was a mission intended, in the words of Ed Miller, a B-17 co-pilot in the 303rd Bomber Group, to let Hitler know that the 8th Air Force existed. The American strategic bombing strategy in the Second World War was designed around the Norden bomb sight. The remarkable device used an analog computer that calculated the plane's ground speed and direction and was connected directly to the plane's autopilot. The device promised an ability to bomb accurately from high altitudes that was unprecedented. But the device depended upon sighting the target. To be used accurately, it had to be used during the day. Daylight raiding made the U.S. planes more vulnerable to anti-air defenses and attacks by fighter aircraft than the bombers of the Royal Air Force, who preferred night raids that were less accurate but subjected the bombers to fewer risks. Previous to 1944, bombers of the 8th Air Force were forced to conduct raids deep into Germany without fighter escort. Small fighter aircraft simply did not have the fuel capacity to accompany the large four-engine bombers so far from their bases. Bombers instead counted on high altitude to protect them from the flak of the heavy anti-aircraft guns and tight bomber formations and the dozen heavy machine guns carried by the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators to stave off the attacks by German Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The result was brutal to the air crews. The German fighters, firing heavy cannons with exploding shells and increasingly accurate German anti-aircraft fire, took a massive toll on U.S. bomber aircraft and their crews. A raid on October 14, 1943, against a ball bearing factory in the Bavarian city of Schweinfurt had resulted in the loss of nearly a quarter of the B-17 bombers on the raid, a loss so dreadful that it became known to the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. In 1942 and 43, a bomber crew of the 8th Air Force had a less than 1 in 5 chance of completing their 25-mission combat tour, meaning that some 80% would wind up killed, captured, or wounded so badly that they would be sent home. Army aviators had the highest casualty rate of the U.S. Armed Forces. But the Allied bomber offensive had changed in 1944. Long-range capable fighters, such as the North American P-51Ds and Republic P-47s, equipped with droppable supplemental fuel tanks, started to become available in large numbers, allowing fighter protection for bombers, even on raids deep into Germany. For the previous 2 years, the Allies had been trying to cripple the German Luftwaffe by attacking aircraft production. The strategy had largely been a failure, forcing Germany to relocate some production, but not slowing their output of airplanes. In fact, German production of fighter aircraft increased throughout the war, and the Bf-109 became the most produced fighter aircraft in history. But with the availability of long-range fighter aircraft capable of challenging the fighters of the Luftwaffe, the 8th Air Force's new commander, legendary pilot James Harold Jimmy Doolittle, planned to draw the pilots of the Luftwaffe into a battle and destroy them in a war of attrition. Where bomber groups once avoided enemy fighters, now they were seeking to force them to engage. The raid on the 6th started with clear weather for takeoff, something that Captain William R. O.B. O'Brien of the 363rd Fighter Squadron described as unique for England. The raid was massive, following Doolittle's strategy of maximum effort that meant that deploying every aircraft that was deemed combat ready. The entire bomber train stretched out over 93 miles. The bomber force was divided into 3 air divisions in more than 24 bomber groups flying from bases throughout East Anglia. The 1st and 3rd Air Divisions were comprised of B-17s, and so were grouped together, with the 242 B-17s of the 3rd Air Division following in the wake of the 262 B-17s of the 1st. They were followed by the 2nd Air Division, comprised of 226 B-24s, who were targeting aircraft factories in Genshagen, south of Berlin. The dangers faced by the crews were starkly illustrated when a B-24 of the 392nd Bombardment Group crashed on takeoff, killing its entire crew. For the rest of the bombers, the trip from bases in Britain to their targets in Berlin would take nearly 9 hours. Anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak, attacked the groups from the moment they crossed over the enemy coast. The clear weather gave out over the continent, with low scattered clouds making navigation difficult. O'Brien noted that he hadn't seen a recognizable landmark since the Zuiderzee Bay in Holland. In the scattered clouds, the 1st and 3rd Air Divisions became separated. The navigator on the lead plane of the 1st Division then made a mistake, failing to account for crossing headwinds. He led the 1st Air Division south of their intended route. The navigator of the lead plane of the 3rd Air Division made the correct calculations, putting the 2 divisions on different courses. The difference would result in tragedy for the more than 2,400 men in the 3rd Division. German radar had picked up the bomber groups as they crossed the Channel. It recognized the gap between the 2 divisions and concentrated their fighters on the 3rd Division. The Allies, assuming the 1st Division would be the first to encounter the German defenses, had massed their defensive fighters over that division. The German fighters sent to intercept the Americans were now able to attack the 3rd Division, defended by just 8 P-47 fighters, with more than 100 Me-109s and FW-190s. The unit that bore the brunt of the attack was the van of the 3rd Air Division, bombers of Combat Wing 13B of the 418th Squadron of the 100th Bomber Group, based at RAF Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk. 10 bombers were shot down in the first attack. Having studied the American bombers, the Germans favored attacking from the front, where the bombers were most vulnerable. With a closing speed in excess of 200 yards per second, the attack took less than a minute. An attacking FW-190 collided with a bomber from the 100th, nicknamed the Nelson King, nearly tearing off the bomber's rear stabilizer. Badly damaged, with only 2 engines operating, the crew realized they would be easily picked off if they tried to make it home alone. They dropped their bombs to reduce weight and followed the rest of the formations over Berlin. In all, 34 of the 242 bombers of the 3rd Division did not make it home. 121 were damaged, 3 beyond repair. 15 of the losses were from the 100th Bomber Group, which thereafter became known as the Bloody 100th. But the navigation issues had a surprising impact over Berlin. The 48 P-51Bs of the 357th Fighter Group, including O.B. O'Brien's, had missed their rendezvous with the bombers. Overshooting Berlin, when they got their bearings, they made a 180-degree turn, bringing them into Berlin from the east. It was a fortunate mistake. As they came over Berlin, they were in a perfect position to attack a group of Luftwaffe fighters that were heading for the bombers of the 1st Division. Doolittle's plan had worked. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to defend Berlin with all they had. Despite being a day raid, they had, for the first time, sent up night fighters in daylight. Designed to track bombers at night using radar, the twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 and 410 fighters were not as maneuverable as the P-51s, were easy targets. O'Brien attacked an Me-110 that he described as easy pickings. The diverting plane crashed into a building, and he later said, "You never saw such a fine explosion. It was plainly visible above 20,000 feet. But his guns jammed after that, and he was forced to make for home." Fighter opposition was described in action reports as some of the fiercest of the war. The Germans deployed as many as 1,000 fighters, some making as many as 5 sorties. A B-17 of the 457th Bomb Group, piloted by Lieutenant Eugene E. Whalen, was the victim of an attack by an Me-109. Whalen's plane exploded, crashing into the bomber piloted by Lieutenant Roy E. Graves. Out of both crews, only the tail gunner of Graves' crew survived. He was captured and held as a POW. The flak was thick over Berlin. Lieutenant Vern L. McClure, pilot of a B-17 nicknamed Thunderbird of the 359th Bomb Group, said over the target it looked like the 4th of July, flak bursting in red flashes and billowing out black smoke all around us. The flak over Berlin was the most accurate and most heavy flak we ever got into. It seemed almost thick enough to drop your wheels and taxi around on it. The raid, which historian Donald L. Miller called the greatest air battle ever, came at a huge cost for the 8th Air Force. 69 bombers and 11 fighters did not make it home. Several more managed to return to their bases but were damaged beyond repair, among them the Nelson King. Hundreds more took significant damage. Moncourt's Thunderbird took hits to 3 of its 4 engines in both its vertical and horizontal stabilizers. But his 359th Bomb Group benefited from fighter cover throughout, and all of its bombers returned home. They were among the lucky, though. The losses on Black Monday far exceeded the losses of Black Thursday the previous October. The 250th raid of the 8th Air Force represented the deadliest day for the 8th Air Force in the Second World War. Even worse, the weather and disruption by the Luftwaffe meant that most of the bombing attacks were off target. Allied headlines claimed that Berlin was without power, light, gas, or telephone service, but the bombing itself was actually ineffective. Ed Miller noted that photos showed that not one of the 303rd Bomber Group's bombs hit their target. But Black Monday nevertheless represented a turning point in the war. Despite their grievous losses to the 8th Air Force, the losses for the German Luftwaffe were much worse, losing nearly 170 fighters that day. In the battle of attrition, the Allies had a training pipeline for their crews and a manufacturing base that allowed them to make good their losses. The Germans, stretched thin across multiple fronts, did not. Between January 1944, when Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force, and June 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the German Luftwaffe lost more than 1,000 experienced pilots in combat. Jimmy Doolittle had drawn them into a battle from which they would never recover. Hermann Goering, Supreme Commander of the German Air Force, was reported to have said after the war, "The day I saw those Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.